We're going to proceed with our lunch speaker, and so I regret having to interrupt your conversations, but we have a interesting talk for you today, and I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Brian Burt, who is an assistant professor in the School of Education. We're welcoming him for a talk here, but we're also welcoming him to campus, so just joined us this past fall, right? And so Brian obtained his Ph.D. In higher education from the University of Michigan with a concentration in academic affairs and student development. His research addresses various areas of STEM education, graduate student learning, persistence and retention, and experience of graduate students of color. He studies institutional practices related to the STEM educational pipeline. And as you can see, today he's going to talk about identifying barriers and improving practices to broaden participation in STEM. Please welcome Brian.
So I tend to be kind of loud, so I'm trying to think of where to position this. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay, perfect, thank you. Well, good afternoon. Before I begin, I first want to thank Diane Rover and Megan Heitman for inviting me to share my work with you. And I also want to thank you all for being here today. I'm very sure that you're going to be active and engaged audience members, in large part because you have this great food in front of you and you can't run away, right? So today I'm going to share with you some key findings from 2 research projects that I've been working on over the last 5 or so years. And I'm going to end with some ideas of how I see the development of my research career here at Iowa State going on in the future. But before I get started, I was talking to Diane just a little bit at the table, and I just need to get a sense of, can you raise your hand if you're a faculty member? Oh, wow, okay. And can you raise your hand if you're staff or administrator? Okay, great. And are there any students in the audience? Okay, great, okay. So I believe that my talk will cover grounds. So if I'm talking or directing something towards staff and administrators, I'm assuming it's still probably applicable to faculty, and vice versa. If I'm talking to faculty, it's still applicable to other categories. And if you're a student, hopefully you might see yourself through the experiences of some of the participants that I will discuss today. But because I'm not really sure everyone's background, I just want to start and provide some type of background so that there is a common understanding or orientation to why I do the work I do and where I'm coming across with my research. So research national reports in the White House continue to call for the improvement of the STEM workforce. Now, consequences of inaction extend far beyond losing ground on educational prestige from a global perspective or global context. But our inability to increase and sustain participation in STEM fields is a matter of national security and infrastructure. Now, coupled with our inability to improve interest in STEM has been the consistent struggle to diversify participation in STEM fields. So let's take, for example, engineering. In 2013, there were approximately 25,000 tenured and tenure-track faculty in engineering across Ph.D. granting institutions. Blacks only represented 2.6%. In that same year, approximately 10,000 doctoral degrees were awarded in engineering, and only 4.1% were awarded to blacks. Disaggregating that number further, black males only made up 1.2% of degrees earned. That's 129 out of roughly 10,000 doctoral degrees in engineering. So as we can see from these numbers in engineering, much work remains to be done to broaden participation in STEM. Now, as someone who studies STEM education, I've noticed that many strategies that address STEM pathways tend to take a bottom-up approach. That is, scholars tend to look at K through 12, Yes. Yes, I'm sorry. So yeah, these numbers are related to domestic. Yes, these do not include international students. Thank you. Thanks for the clarification. Um, so what I've noticed in existing scholarship is that scholars tend to, or much of the existing scholarship tends to look at improving STEM education from a a bottom-up approach, right? Meaning they're looking at how can we improve K through 12 education as a way to get students excited to choose STEM majors, and to engage in the STEM workforce. And I'm not suggesting that that's bad, but I'm suggesting that there are alternative approaches. One such approach is to focus on doctoral education. Upon graduation, doctoral students are expected to replenish the STEM workforce through academic and non-academic careers, and mentor future generation of scientists. Thus, investigating the experiences that promote or turn students away from the STEM workforce would provide new understandings of the complexity of science participation. This top-down approach may be especially important when we take into consideration the participation of underrepresented students, meaning women and students of color. So there are a couple things that I want you to think about as this presentation continues, as well as when you're doing your work. One, what are some of the critical contexts, relationships, and practices in STEM doctoral education? And two, how do these contexts, relationships, and practices serve as barriers or supports to broadening participation in STEM? So I want to start by talking about my research, but I need your help a little bit. So I'm going to ask you to use some of your imagination, okay? So very briefly, I want you to think about, in your head, what does it look like to be a scientist, or an image of a scientist? Okay, because I don't want you thinking too long. First image. So for many students, who they've read, who they've seen, who they've heard about, who are the representations in the classroom, the scientist tends to look like this. Or this. Increasingly, this. But rarely do students see, hear, learn about, become mentored by scientists that look like this. Now, why does that matter? Well, let's put into context these models of scientists. Again, let's imagine that these scientists represent a fraction of who students will see every day in their classroom, in their research groups, in their departments, and at the college level. This might be who they encounter. So let me remind us again of some of those statistics. Using engineering. In 2013, the engineering faculty were comprised domestically of 85.5% were comprised of men. The faculty, engineering faculty, were 85.5% men, leaving 14.5% women. This also included 68% white faculty, 25% Asian, 3.6% Hispanic, and 2.6% black. Now, I should mention, as was mentioned before, this is not disaggregated by the intersections of race and gender. So I want us to use a little bit of our imagination. It also does not include international faculty, right? So that would also change a little bit of what the image looks like. But this is only 50 images. Here at Iowa State, the College of Engineering has approximately 250 faculty members. So it would be 5 times this. So if you're a person of color, it's not likely that you're going to see many models of scientists who look like you, or take classes from those scientists. Or same thing with a woman. It'll be very rare that you'll have a class from another woman instructor. So why is that important? Well, I want to introduce you to some of the students in my first study. The first study of Perseverance and Triumph, Black Male Doctoral Students Surviving and Striving in Engineering, was a project that included 15 black male doctoral students at one institution, a public institution of AAU status. And what I wanted to understand was not the narrative of why black males are dropping out, not why they need remediation. That story has been told to ad nauseum. What I rather want to understand was, one, how are they experiencing engineering? And despite their barriers, how are they able to overcome that and be successful? Some brief findings from that study was that the College of Engineering environment, including its practices and policies, created an unhealthy and unsupportive environment. Racial microaggressions, which are cues or slights to students that came from generally their faculty and peers, they threatened the students' persistence and made them feel unwelcome. As a result, students decided that, we don't have time to wait for new policies that will support us or new resources and supports that will support us. We will support each other. So there are a couple of salient quotes that I want to share with you from these students. So Marcus, a third-year mechanical engineer, says, I would ideally love for there to be more African-American men in my classes. People are naturally going to want to be around people who look like them. I look at the Asians, and when they come here, they have their own niche right away. Even though they are in a foreign country, they are completely comfortable. But as a black man in engineering, I don't have that camaraderie. So I'm forced to immediately look outside of my comfort zone in order to find people who I can study with, talk with, and have overall support. There just is not that support for me here to succeed. There's a lot embedded in Marcus's quote. A couple things that I want to note. He talks about his international Asian peers and their camaraderie. Along with that camaraderie, he also discussed this notion of study groups. Well, interestingly, the black male participants talked about how study groups were important mechanisms for their success while they're in the early years of their academic careers and coursework. But unfortunately, they felt that they had to prove that they were good enough to be admitted to the university. They had to prove that they were good enough to be in the research group. They had to prove that they were good enough to be in people's study groups. And many times, that mechanism that was important for their success, being in a study group, they were rejected from those study groups. So while they're comparing themselves to other peers in study groups, many of them were not able to be in study groups. So they learned that to be successful, they had to learn how to negotiate and navigate engineering by themselves. Paul also says, it's not just my advisor, but it's also the department, the school, the social scene. I think all of those things, if you don't feel like you have a positive or supportive environment in any of those, they could all be reasons that you wouldn't want to stick around here for a long time. So taking Marcus and Paul's quotes together, we understand that there's several embedded contexts in how students experience engineering. And these contexts have the potential to serve as barriers to broadening participation in STEM. What I learned from the black male study was that Of course, it's about context and it's about these relationships. But I also learned from them that there's a very important experience that students are having, and that is the experience in their research group. So that led me to my second study, which was the influence of doctoral research experiences on the pursuit of the engineering professoriate. Now, this study was informed by that first study, but this one was different. This one did not have a black male focus specifically. However, I was interested in understanding what students are learning and how they're learning from participation in a research group. And one of the decisions that I did make when I was selecting research groups is that the group had to at least have one or more black males in the research group. So it wasn't that I was focused on the black male in the group, but I at least wanted to be in a context where I was able to observe a black male and how he engaged or interacted in this group. But with this study was different because it wasn't solely one-on-one interviews. It was, for 13 months, I observed or almost moved in to this research group. I attended their weekly research meetings, their weekly subgroup meetings. There were 3 students that went to a conference. I traveled to the conference with them for 5 days, and I shadowed them to understand how they put into practice what they're learning from their research group. And I also had the chance to go to their out-of-class or out-of-class gatherings, so the gatherings at their faculty supervisor's house. So what I learned from that study was that the design and execution of research practices from the research supervisor, as well as students' perceptions of faculty work, shape students' understandings and intentions to pursue faculty careers. So I want to share a couple quotes from students. Sherman says, "I can't tell you how many emails I've gotten from Professor Houston at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And I love engineering, I love research science, but I just got married and we want to have a family eventually. I have no desire to answer emails at 4 o'clock in the morning." And Tiffany similarly compares herself to her faculty mentor, says, you know, after sighing really deeply, "I think the bar to be faculty is higher than for industry. For faculty, it requires more qualities of people. You basically need to have everything. You need to have a decent technical background. You need to have a good personality. You need to know how to manage people and how to work with people. You need to know what are the trends and how to organize grant proposals. And to me right now, I don't have the confidence to say I have all those qualities to get a faculty position." The interesting thing about these 2 quotes, as well as this project, is the magnitude of the impact of a research supervisor on students' understandings of what it means to be a faculty member. So what do I mean by that? Faculty, you have a tremendous responsibility in modeling for students what it means to potentially be a faculty member, right? Are you complaining about grant proposals? Are you complaining about teaching? Or are you excited about those things? Because however you are displaying those images or those messages, students are listening and observing, and it's shaping how they think about the professoriate. Now, compounded with that are issues of race and gender, and if you have questions about that, I can answer some of those later. All right, so what I've done so far is given you glimpses of some of my research. But what I want to do is leave you with some ideas about future work and potential collaborations that stem from these projects. I see my future work branching into 2 main umbrellas or branches. The first one is going to be similar to those images I showed you, and understanding how to develop and maintain a science identity. Some questions that I'm thinking about are, what does a science identity look like for doctoral students, especially underrepresented students, and how can we measure it? There's already some literature about a science identity for K through 12, right? What does it mean to get young girls and young students of color excited and interested in science, right? But what about when students have already gone through K through 12 and college? What does a science identity look like for them? And how can we maintain that? And how do we measure that? That's going to be a major area of research. And I'm excited to be on the forefront of that. I'm also interested in continuing this theme that I've shared throughout this talk is how do context, relationships, and practices influence the development and or maintenance of students' science identity? And finally, what is the relationship between students' science identity and the STEM workforce? The other branch that I'm looking at is going to be related to the science of team science. So what and how do students learn from participating in research groups, and how does that participation prepare students for STEM careers? And how does research group participation influence students' science identity? So that'll be a way to link back to the other umbrella. So I want to leave you with some concluding thoughts. So here at Iowa State, we're celebrating increased enrollments, and I think that that is fantastic. But how do enrollments impact the college and classroom composition? That's something that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about broadening participation in STEM, right? So when critical masses of students are admitted, do we have the necessary support structures to guarantee their progress and graduation? So for example, during my career at Iowa State, I really hope to see the numbers of black students increase in engineering here at Iowa State. But just increasing the numbers of enrollment is not going to be good enough if we don't have the supportive structures to keep them and graduate them. And by supportive structures, I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about remedial education. What I'm referring to are, for example, models of scientists that they can see as mentors, as faculty. Other students that they can have as peers for study groups. Those are, and also people who can play the role to provide students with emotional support. Those are the supports that I'm referring to. For faculty, as I mentioned before, faculty play an immense role in the development of students' identities. Faculty help students learn about research, learn about careers, and help students shape their thinking of their future selves. One thing I learned at the end of my dissertation research was how do faculty think about their work as research supervisors? One way to consider it is to think of your research group as you would your class in the development of a syllabus, right? When you're designing your class, you're thinking of, or hopefully you're thinking of learning outcomes and goals and outcomes of your students. Well, think of your research group as the same way. What is it that you want students to take away from how you structure the group, whether it be weekly research meetings or one-on-one meetings or weekly presentations? Are you training students for faculty positions, for industry, to be entrepreneurs? Be conscious of those type of things when you're designing your research group. And finally, just a general observation from my research. It appears that students are not being heard. And I'm not talking about expressing their or being heard via surveys, but I got the sense that students have not had a chance beyond my interactions with them in these studies to express what they're learning, their satisfaction, their career interests before engaging with me. And it seems like that would be a valuable opportunity to engage with students and to really understand what students want and what students need. And the final thing I want to say is if we continue to implement the same practices and policies, we will yield the same results. But if we want new results, we also have to implement innovative practices and policies. So I will conclude there, and I am excited to answer any questions that you may have.
Questions for Brian?
Yes.
So, quick question, you're talking about kind of top-down approach and role modeling. I'm wondering if you had any observations or interactions or feedback from your study participants of observing perhaps that underrepresented faculty members teaching majority white students, or likely that underrepresented minority graduate students as a TA teaching majority white students. I wonder if you have any observations about that.
Can you kind of rephrase the question?
So I believe the question is, do I have observations of underrepresented faculty members teaching majority students and underrepresented students as TAs teaching majority students, correct? I don't necessarily have, so I do have data on that, but they did not speak on that. The students who spoke more about their experiences as TAs were my international participants. They discussed that it was from that it wasn't the research experience, they loved that. It was the teaching experience that made them so fearful of being in front of the classroom that was enough for them not to want to be a faculty member. So the TA experience was only brought up as it related to my international student participants. Yes?
You mentioned this role of microaggressions in the experiences of the students. And my understanding, I got introduced to this term fairly recently. So as I understand, sometimes these are unconscious on the part of the people committing them, right? Because it's built by their experiences, societal constructs, whatever it is. Could you give some examples for us on what, from your study, were some examples of microaggressions that students experience the most so that we can kind of be aware of them?
Right. So the question was about racial microaggressions, the fact that sometimes they are unconsciously done by the, by the aggressor. I was thinking of the right word. And so the first one that comes to mind is one of the black male students in the research group. He was in a research group, and he mentioned that he had some type of responsibility in the group, and that the faculty member would publicly chastise him and not chastise anyone else. But and you know, some people may say, well, you know, that was just giving constructive criticism. But the constructive criticism, I think, was always about his inability to do something, right? It wasn't about showing him how to do it. It was about criticizing his ability. And I think it was that, plus it was done publicly. So that's one that stands out first. I'm trying to think of another one. That was a great question, and I'm trying to think of where it falls in my paper that I've written. Yeah.
You're getting, you're here to contribute to, I think this, the ISU community, the faculty community at least, or the student community would be very well served. It would be helpful for them, even if somewhere on a website or whatever it is, that they are aware of what these things, what examples are. Because I think even I may be guilty of doing this. I may not want to do it on purpose, but you know, it's just like this notion of unconscious bias that exists in kind of gender diversity issues as well. I think this would be very, very helpful for the community. So I think.
We will touch on this again in the second session this afternoon. Kristen Constant is talking about WEPAN's new webinar series on inclusive teaching, and it's from the engineering perspective, but it really does apply to all of STEM. And I think there are webinars in that series that relate to microaggressions and other things like that. So, so Kristen will give us an introduction to that, again, it's going to be oriented towards how faculty might use that in their proposals and propose new practices in their classroom, et cetera. But hopefully, we're getting a few pieces put together here that we can start to just create greater awareness, because I think, like you said, all of us are interested in doing better.
One microaggression, at least from student, like peer-to-peer, that was very visible was one student remembered or recalled a time where he was trying to get into a study group, and a student said something to the effect of, "You're really not supposed to be here because you were admitted from affirmative action," right? Whether that's true or not, it was a gross misinterpretation of the admissions process and, just so many other things. So that was a very blatant one, but sometimes they're not as blatant. But I have discussed it, and I will be able to discuss some of that more in future writing. Yes?
To echo that about the study group, our science-bound students, there were two of our sophomores, no, maybe they're juniors. They were talking, and it was so matter of fact. They were like, well, we don't get into any of the study groups, so we always have to do our assignments offline or by ourselves. And I looked at them and I said, are you kidding me? And so one of the ways to avoid that would be to assign, if you would have a policy to say, if no one has a study group, please get your name to me, and the TAs or what have you can assign them to a group, or either assign groups, because to have a student go through college thinking, I'm never going to be in a group, that really, I don't want to be so emotional, but that really hurt my heart to hear that. And these are brilliant students, so that's a subtle microaggression that involves just simple exclusion.
And that triggered something very quickly. As a result of people being denied from several study groups, they learned as a coping strategy that they wanted to now prove that they were good enough to do it on their own. And for many of them, what I didn't say is that out of the 15 participants, 12 of them have earned their Ph.D.s. 3 are on the road to finishing up this year or next year. But the stories of what they had to endure to, quote unquote, prove that they were good enough not only shapes their experiences in engineering, but it threatens their sustained participation in STEM. When it would be easier, I didn't show this quote, but it's easier, as some students mentioned, to just switch to, this is their words, to switch to business or to switch to something else that would be more lucrative.
I think this also is a good connection to the first session this afternoon on some of the grad learning communities. Some of you might be talking about that. And in a way that helps give some of this not only academic support, but really the social support and the kind of structures that are in the grad learning communities might help facilitate some of these types of study groups.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll break and we'll get started at 1 o'clock. See you Sunday.